And we're back. You're listening to the Community Radio Show on Richmonds WLEE News Talk 990. Numbers to call in, 788-0990. We're talking about Muslim identity and American identity. And is there a clash, a conflict, or is it just, some little hodgepodge of ideas? We have two callers on the line. We're going to take Beth first. And Beth, you are on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi. Hi, guys. This is Beth Kimbriel. How are you doing?
Well, thanks.
Very good.
I'm calling on both topics, actually. What you just finished talking about, or before you went on break, religion versus government
Right.
loyalty. Well, first of all, what you were talking about, Hadi, with schools and imposing religion and not, one over the other.
Right. In this particular case, it was in Florida, in which they were not willing to accommodate teacher schedules for people, for particular Muslims taking holiday, 2 holidays off.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that here in Virginia, gosh, all of my life, Christian holidays have been celebrated, and to the exclusion of all of the other religions. Mm-hmm. And, Christmas parties, Christmas trees, and singing religious Christian songs in choir at Christmas time. All of those things have always been done. So when I hear people not accommodating other religions, it gets me riled up.
Understandable.
So, and then on the other topic, I will be voting for Barack Obama.
Oh, one for Barack.
All right. We at least have one person that was listening to what we asked him to do. Salvin's clapping over here like, yeah.
Great. Well, we do appreciate that input.
Thanks for calling.
And definitely, we do notice that, it's especially with Christmas and whatnot, it's always been a very strong presence there. So to not kind of reciprocate that to other faiths when we're in this melting pot,
exactly.
This separation of church and state, country. Hey, everybody should be accommodated. Definitely appreciate your comments.
Right.
And
thanks for listening.
I do want to say one other thing, and
Sure,
that is when I hear people say they're not going to vote, that also gets me riled up.
Definitely.
I really believe that it is a citizen's duty, not just a privilege, to vote. And, for this particular election, I think it's very important for middle and low income people especially to vote, because
Agreed.
if we have a Romney presidency, we're going to go back to the unregulated financial system that got us right back, that'll get us right back where we were in 2008.
Yep.
Right. Appreciate your call. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. That was interesting. Yeah, I our guest is just on the line. I'll come up with this dilemma that I have with my Boy Scouts and kind of how. And I think these things are things that the general population, I want to say, as Christians, I don't think these little intricacies they don't realize, and I don't think there's any kind of malicious intent behind it. It's just the reality of what we are. So.
It's just it's historically, how the country has been. Yeah.
So we're bringing on Ibrahim Abdul Mateen, who's the author of Green Deen: What Islam Teaches About Protecting the Planet, and contributor to All American, 45 American Men on Being Muslim. He's a former sustainability policy advisor to New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who just endorsed Obama. A regular contributor to WNYC's radio's nationally syndicated news show, The Takeaway, and a lead innovation consultant at the Frontier Project. Ibrahim, are you on the line?
Hello?
Hello, Ibrahim?
Yes.
Yeah, welcome to the show. Good morning.
Hey, it's great to be here. Alhamdulillah.
Thanks for agreeing to call in. That's kind of early for some people.
You're still on the East Coast, right? Flying around the planet again, are you?
No, I'm here. I'm just chilling out. We're gonna head to the farmers market pretty soon.
Farmers market.
Farmers markets. Oh, can I put in a request? I want some pomegranates, if you can pick some up for
Hey, I
me.
need some kettle corn.
What you want, Salvin? What do you want? Tell us what
We
you
got
want.
a shopping list for you, man.
I didn't tell you we were going to give you a shopping list when I asked you to come on. But seriously, thanks for coming on. I don't know if you had been listening. So we're talking about basically the perception that Muslims use their religion as their primary point of identification, in which by default means that there's inherent conflict with that and their allegiance to a particular country. In this case, it would be specifically the United States.
U.S. of A.
My first thought about that is have you ever heard of Stocko and Vanzetti? These are two. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
We were thinking. Pause.
Yeah.
we had a slight break in the mental process.
Sorry. Go
ahead.
Go ahead.
These were two Italian immigrants at the turn of the century that started a food program for poor Italian immigrants in Boston, and they were considered because basically what they were doing was feeding folks and making sure they had basic things, and they were considered, because they were immigrants and they were Italian, they were considered to be anarchists by the government at the time, and they were and so that incident was a really watershed moment for Italians in America, and it was part of this larger thing that I'm trying to describe, is this sense of this your identity is you're defined by how you got here. You're defined by your relationship to this land. And the only outlier from that, the only exception to that rule, is the dominant power. So a white male who's an American doesn't have to qualify how they got here or their relationship to this land. Women have to, and you notice this by, like, let's say Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina.
Right.
She's the first female governor, so they always mention that she's Indian American and she's female. You look at like the Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Catholic Americans. Everyone has a sort of signifier. Even Native Americans have a signifier that lets people know their relationship to this land. So I don't think it's anything unique or even revolutionary or even alarming in any sense of the way that Muslims would have a similar signifier, just to let people know. It basically lets everyone know that we are not white, male, Christian. That's basically what it says.
So are you saying, so this signifier that minority groups use to identify themselves, is that something that these particular groups do? Is it kind of, or does it grow organically from within that group, or is it the projection of the majority into the minority group that you are, fill in the blank?
I think it's both, right? I mean, you're trying to, in a case where you have these immigrant communities, the Irish, the Italians, coming into a country where it was a Protestant identity. It was a very Anglo-Saxon, like very strong identity, where these original European immigrants at the turn of the century were holding on to their identity, and so they were sort of reinforcing the fact that they were something. They were indigenous to a place, which I think is an important
But
point.
here's the issue, and in looking at that synopsis there. Now, take somebody like me, right? I'm African American. Okay, I was brought here, historically. Okay, so I mean, you have that time, but now the second that you say, "Oh, I'm Muslim," then that I guess you could say affiliation can sort of break down that initial connection with being American. And that's, I think, where the problem is. There's a lot of people that may be, Italian American or really from anywhere across the globe, but once you put on that tag that you're Muslim, or that you have an Islamic background, then it almost dilutes, the strength of your connection to America to the point where it's going to be questioned,
I think, yeah. I mean,
and that happened in the military. A friend of mine who's African American, he had that issue where basically, the military had went through and they were questioning people in terms of their allegiance to the military and their allegiance to the country. And it had really nothing to do with their origin. It was just a simple fact of, this is what you believe, well, we still have to question, your connection to the country. So from that standpoint, I mean, how do we kind of rope all of that together in terms of what is really, I guess, parallel to?
I think it's funny because people always try to get excuses to push black people out of the tent, right? Like, I think it's not. I think it's more about the inherent, intrinsic racism that exists in some parts of this country, and then it relates to our religious affiliation. It's just another convenient way to push us apart. Look at Muhammad Ali. He was, everyone loves him now because he can't really communicate. But when he could communicate, they didn't love him. And when he was Cassius Clay, you still see some folks that will say, "Oh, Cassius Clay."
They won't call him Muhammad Ali. They'll call him Cassius Clay. Yeah.
But at the same time, there is no denying his Americanness, and this is where I think we need, as African Americans, we really have to hold the line, because a lot of people have attacked me for the book the book I wrote, and saying, well, what about Muslims around the globe, and what about your identity? Are you a Muslim or are you an American? Listen, my ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. I know my identity. I don't have to prove it to anybody. Right? So if we want to sit down and have a conversation about who's been here longer or who's shed more blood for this land, that's a no-brainer. As African Americans, we top the list of because we can't go back anyplace.
Right.
There's no.
Right. For a lot of us, our heritage stops. Our bloodline stops here in America because we can't trace it back any further. Yeah.
It's interesting you did that, because that's a perfect segue into my next question. This was not a setup.
Could be good or bad.
And so if I set that up, and so if you can look at the population of Muslims in America, I mean, obviously we have to differentiate between the population that is immigrant or children of immigrants that have their roots into the immigrant movement from the 60s and a little bit before that, and then you have the indigenous population of African American Muslims. And part of what's seen from someone who's not within that community is, I think, because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think there's that break in that identity for African Americans, that more so than with immigrants, that Islam is used as the primary vehicle of identification.
Real quick, before you answer that, numbers to call in, 788-0990 or 1-877-953-3990. If anybody out there would like to jump in on the conversation, feel free. Back to you.
So we're saying that, okay. So could you rephrase that, though?
Yeah, so for example...
Too many words, man.
Too many words. Okay. African American Muslims use Islam as their primary identification piece, right? Compared to an immigrant Muslim who identifies with their country of origin first. And I don't think those two things can be necessarily compared, because in their country of origin, that Islam is already mixed in within their culture. And so specifically with African Americans here that are Muslim, it's viewed as, that Islam is their primary point of identification.
Yeah. Okay, so I think in this instance, you're talking about African Americans. Many of us, my father and my mother, they worked first with the Nation of Islam. They were first in the Nation of Islam, and then they converted to Sunni Islam, and they made a conscious decision at each juncture to sort of get a better sense of their selves and a better knowledge of self, and then understand their relationship to the Creator in the process. So a deeply spiritual choice. But at the same time, the deeply spiritual choice was also it was almost a liberation theology, right? So, as African Americans, we have been basically our movements and our identity of self is related to getting freedom, accessing a knowledge of self. So, when we connect ourselves to Islam, it's connecting ourselves to a sense of deep spiritual awakening and liberation, as opposed to if you're coming from another country, you might that connection to a sense of liberation or a sense of a knowledge of self is very, very different, right? You're coming to America as an immigrant to make money. You're not coming to America to be a better Muslim. You're not coming to America to be the best person you can be. You're coming to America. You're not even coming to America like the Pilgrims came to have religious freedom.
Right.
You're coming to America to get paid. And so there's an inherent difference in the way that they identify with that. Of course, they're going to be, they might, and before 9/11, they were more reticent to acknowledge their identity because they were like, listen, I just want to blend in and make my money and make my loot and not ruffle anything. Whereas as African Americans, we're like, you know what? We've been ruffled and we've been fighting, and and everything's stacked up against us. This peg on us is basically separating us from years of abuse and drugs and alcohol and other things that have ravaged our communities. We put a peg down, and we can say, we're going to change this, and we're going to liberate ourselves from this history in this process.
Right, and so if I can ask, so with that concept of that liberation, the next logical jump, if I can play devil's advocate, would be because of that movement and because of that liberation that you said towards the creator, that inherently creates some conflict with your allegiance to the country.
Listen, this is the deal. Any allegiance to anything other than God is false, right? So that's his baseline.
Right.
However, as a Muslim, our responsibility is to obey the laws of the land that we exist under. Yeah. And I think out of anybody in this country that has done that more consistently, it has been African Americans, because we understand the truth. We understand the value of the Constitution. We know the Declaration of Independence. We've lived with the history of the Civil Rights Movement and before that, the Reconstruction and all the other movements to liberate ourselves from slavery. So we understand these things from a deep, deep perspective. So this notion that we would have to qualify our love for the land that we live on is absurd to me. Just take this. As a people, we have consistently taken on the best of those ideals when we've been put in positions of being the first. So someone is the first mayor or the first president. They consistently reach out and try and create more bonds of connection as opposed to, asserting a sense of like superiority of our group over another. So I think, time and time again, African Americans have tried to exhibit the best of the ideals of the American experience, and Islam is a vehicle for us to do that, and also to liberate ourselves in the process.
Right. So I'm going to take off my devil's advocate hat now and come back to my It's very interesting that observation that you made, in that it's actually very true. If you speak how immigrant Muslims view America and how African Americans view America, not necessarily African American Muslims, just African Americans view America, is through a completely different prism. Right. Because a completely different experience. And that from the immigrant perspective, they are coming here, you said, for that money, but for the for that opportunity that exists, and that promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then from the African American experience, they're like, well, wait a minute, we've been prevented from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and look how much our struggles are. So they can't understand
in multiple stages,
right?
Through time.
And so I will say this, that the African American community has consistently been about creating and crafting an American Islam, right? So from the very, very beginnings, the idea of Islam had to fit within an African American context, and that to me is something you cannot lose. And this is where the Muslim community in the United States has shifted back to, is maybe framing everything by back home or those other countries is not the best way. And so all these scholars and thinkers have been thinking, how do we have an American Islam that reflects the challenges that Americans are facing? Well, and why do we look to scholars that don't even understand our context from people overseas? Why would a fatwa written in Saudi or South America or South Africa relate to something in Brooklyn or in San Diego? Those things, and I think African Americans have consistently thought about this from a deep perspective, starting with the Nation of Islam and Imam Muhammad, really thinking it through. And not to say that we've done it well, but we've been really diligent at trying and breaking down some of the thought barriers to actually actualizing that.
Right.
Yeah, but I would have to interject that sometimes, I guess when you say American Islam, it kind of throws up a red flag for me. That's all. I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, I think that sometimes we can try to change things too much to try to, as you said, fit in to, I guess, an American mainframe, an American structure, whatever that might be, which, depending on who you talk to, that still, differs. But I think that there's still a lot of wisdom and knowledge that, can come from, I guess, like you said, fatwas that have been, given for certain instances overseas, but not necessarily that we have to, throw a lot of things out and try to rebuild. I don't want people to try to think that, as an African American, we're trying to reshape Islam. We're not trying to change Islam at all. There's just certain things that may fit in a certain way based on, strengths of, hadith and importance in terms of how it relates to, living in America, but not that we're, changing anything.
I guess the only thing I would say to that is just the idea that, most of the religious leadership is not trained to even tackle this question of identity, right? The conversation is, well, you're a Muslim, you're fine. That's the end of the conversation. And instead of like having a little bit of nuance to what, like to your point, there's a nuanced understanding. If you're tackling a family issue or a personal issue, or if you're dealing with like a political issue or something at work where someone's putting you in and saying, well, and maybe segregating you from a group because they perceive that you think you're different. You wear a poofy or you have a beard or some kind of weird thing that's not the norm from what they understand. That how does an imam whose orientation is solely external going to understand how to help you manage that situation?
In a totally different country and under a completely different context.
Exactly. So I hear you, Hari, 100% on that. I think there's a caution with, like, we're not trying to recreate, right, because I think African Americans have made a lot of mistakes trying to do that, and we failed miserably in many instances. Right.
All right, we're gonna jump into a break. If you would stay on the line with us, we greatly appreciate it. Numbers to call in 788-0990. That's 788-0990 or 1-877-953-3990. You're listening to Community Radio Show. We're talking about identity, Muslim identity, American identity, identity in general. How does it fit into the culture and the country that we live in? We'll be right back in a minute. Hold on tight, and we'll see you back.